I'm Clive Hale. Thanks for joining us for another of our For Love or Money programmes, which comes tonight from the national capital, Canberra, and Australia's most famous family home, the Lodge. Well, getting right down to the pleasure of business, our first antique tonight comes from an anonymous collector, and fittingly, while we're talking about Australia's top people, it's claimed that this very beautiful piece was actually made for the Colonial incumbent of the top spot on our Australian pecking order, the Queen's representative himself, the Governor-General of that day, which I guess, panel, makes it rather precious stuff, or does it?
Well, Clive, it's a very typical and very delightful late 18th century teapot, a very typical ovoid shape, a straight spout and fruitwood handle. Pineapple finial, of course, the pineapple being the sign of hospitality. But may I guess which incumbent it was from the crest that you see here?
Yes.
Actually, there's a rather nice depiction of a rainbow. There looks like a globe which is broken. And underneath that, there is a Latin inscription, at spes non fracata. In other words, but hope is not broken. In other words, the world might break, but hope is not broken. So I assume it's Hope, Lord Hopetoun, who was first Governor-General in 1900. And I assume this was his family teapot. Peter?
Yes, I think it's a jolly nice teapot, so typical of the end of the 18th century. And it's interesting, I remember, with those hallmarks, and the lady on the opening day was actually pointed out that it was made in 1788 in London, same birthday as Australia. So important on two reasons: Australia's birthday and belonged to Australia's first Governor-General.
So it's almost Australiana, but not quite. Peter, what were you looking so closely at?
I was just looking at the hallmarks, Clive, and they're just nicely marked that there's no wear. It's by John Lamb, made in London. But the whole thing just shrieks that late 18th century. As Anna was saying, the last quarter, these bands, this sort of bright cut engraving, this sort of vertical sort of ribbing effect. And the little pineapple. Often you'll get them, you know, sort of carved out like a pineapple. Carved out of ivory in the shape of the pineapple. It's English that stops and starts there. The fact it belonged to Lord Hopetoun is interesting.
It's funny, a lot of
probably adds a slight about
silver teapots are really ridiculously cheap. This at auction would probably go for less than $2,000.
Well, prints, as collectibles, can be very unpredictable in both the love and money sense. Obviously, you can tire of them, and their path through the investment market can be haphazard. Mr. Greg Phillips of Dutton in the ACT, however, is looking for a happy surprise with his prints, which he bought at an antique shop way back in 1960 for the princely sum of £4.10. And in this case, I suspect he's clearly on the right track. Can you identify and value, please, panel, these prints?
And date. I'd like the viewers to date them stylistically before we give them a dates.
They're wonderful prints, Clive. When you look first at them, they're very typical of the lithographic process. And in fact, the lithographic process is a means of drawing with a greasy crayon on stone, and then putting ink over that sort of greasy crayon area, and then taking a print off that. And of course, wherever the greasy crayon wasn't, ink or was, ink wouldn't adhere. All that sounds fairly complicated, but you can see down the bottom that they've actually said, I think, drawn on stone here. On stone by G.F. Watts.
And the end result makes it look as if, in fact, as if
and I say here, they say here, drawn from life. I would have thought there would have been a lot of poetic licence in the way they've done these, but from life. And you get that granular effect there with a lithograph.
It really looks just like a crayon, and indeed that's exactly what it's been done.
And this is presumably prior to numbering. We don't know how many of these were made.
And no, the lithographic printing process was sort of perfected a few years prior to this, about 1797, and probably a few hundred of each one.
Very Regency in design, aren't they? You know, when you hold a look at the pose, the hairstyle,
early 19th century.
the pose, it's wonderful.
It's interesting, in the early 19th century, Chapel wouldn't be missing on this. They were bowling underarm in the early...
Really?
No, they really were in the early 19th century. Interesting also that the MCC, always remember, a year older than Australia, the 1787, who are the gods of cricket.
They're lovely prints, Clive. As a general rule, lithographs are much more highly valued than, say, engravings. Engravings can produce a great number, and they're far more common.
I think it's also the subject matter, Anna. You know, you don't see a lot of this type of thing.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, you heard how much they cost in 1960.
Well, I think he's made a sort of a wise purchase.
I think
$500 each.